computer. Okay, and now I'm going to shift to spotlight myself. And I'm also going to mute everybody. And then Kim, you can unmute yourself. And we can get underway. So welcome to, this is our 10th and final meeting for the SI Anthology. And I had tentatively thought about just following right straight through with the Society of the Spectacle, like starting 2 weeks from now. But I think that I'm going to postpone that for about a month and a half. And the reason is that the main reason is in late February and early March, I'm getting some eye operations, which are not serious. They're just like a cataract, lens replacement kind of deal, which is a very routine thing apparently these days. But there will be a few days there where I have an eye patch on and I may be uncomfortable or, stressed out or something like that. So anyway, I thought if I started and then got into that, I would probably not want to schedule meetings during that period. And so I am free 2 weeks from now, but I thought it might be simpler just to, not do a meeting and then do another meeting 2 months later. It'll be simpler if we just take a little break here. And I have some other things that I kind of need to do in February anyway, so it will make it a little easier on me. And then
It also makes sense, Ken, that then it'll be the Society of the Spectacle instead of Society of the Spectacles.
Yes, that's a very good point. So so the meeting, and I will be announcing this tomorrow to the broader list, including people who aren't here, and including, I already announced February 11th on Facebook, like a couple of weeks ago, thinking, not, and so I'm going to go back on Facebook and say that it's postponed. So everybody should know. Anyway, the date that I'm planning to restart is March 24th. Once again, it's a Sunday. And at that point, for at least the near future, we would get back to our every other week schedule. And meanwhile, after this meeting today, you should all get the book, if you don't already have it, which is this edition, translated and annotated by Ken Knabb. And you can get it from various distributors. I think it's probably on Amazon too. So you should definitely have this one, not one of the other translations. Although it's fine if you have the other translations, because it's interesting to compare every once in a while. If we have some gnarly deal, we can see what some of the other translators did with it. So you should get that if you don't already have it. And if you do already have it, there's certainly nothing wrong with just reading the whole thing. It's not a very big book. And the more you know about it going in or have refreshed your mind, if you have it, you may have read it long ago or whatever. The more familiar with it, the better this close reading will be, because you'll already sort of know what's coming up in later chapters and get an idea of where you're going. But when we do get into it, as I've said before, we're going to be much, much more detailed than these last 10 sessions have been. These sessions, even though we've taken 10 meetings, to do the book is pretty big. This is the Situationist Anthology. And so obviously we can't go over every paragraph or something, basically we just look at each article and maybe pick out a few key themes or whatever you have to ask about. So we've covered a lot of that, but it's in no way can we say this has been pretty thorough. But when we get to Society of the Spectacle, which is a much shorter book, but much more condensed, we will be extremely thorough. We're going to be reading every word of it slowly and carefully and going over each sentence. I mean, I can't guarantee that everybody will understand every sentence or something, but we're going to try, to explain, what's going on here. What does this imply? How is it connected with the rest of the book? How is it connected with these various Situationist articles that we've already read? All that. So I estimate 12 meetings. And towards the end, we'll also view Debord's film, Society of the Spectacle, closely and discuss that, which gives Debord's own take, coming from a different angle. So that's coming up. And, while you're waiting for March 24th to come around, just, feel free to look into it ahead of time. And then when we get to it, like I say, the first meeting is just going to be 10 or 12 pages. It'll be the first chapter. So it'll be easy to read it. It's just that, part of it is going to be difficult, and we'll go back over it when we get to it. So to get to these current articles we've been reading, we have three categories here that were assigned. The first is miscellaneous publications, that were things that were not in the journal, and they were not part of a Situationist book. And then there's the internal texts, which happen to be all late texts, 1969 through 71. There were internal texts, of course, dating back to the beginning, but I didn't pick any of those. It's the later ones that are of most interest, I think. And then we have that section in the appendix that I call The Blind Man and the Elephant, which is a collection of reactions of various people over the years to the Situationists. So starting out with the miscellaneous publications, we have the theses on the Paris Commune, which is, let's see where it is. That's taking it a little out of order here because this little text on the commune was actually written in 1962, and which was a little later than some of the other texts we'll be looking at. But I thought we'd start with it because it's kind of in a class by itself. This happens the commune is celebrated every March 18th, I think, because that's when it was officially proclaimed in 1871. And so you have to picture that Debord and Vanegem and Attila Cottagny are sitting in a bar on that day. And one or the other of them says, hey, it's, Paris Commune Day. And they start talking about it. And they said, well, why don't we, we have our own views, that are, let's sit down here for a couple hours and see what things we have to say about it, And so they sit down and write this little text, which covers 4 pages in the anthology. So a very little text made up of, I think 14 little numbered theses. And but each of them is, as you might imagine, is extremely pithy. And they quote this thing about well, anyway, I'm not going to go through it. It's like they're looking back on this famous, important thing in revolutionary history and saying, what's our take on this? What why was it defeated? Could it have been different? What were the positives that we think are interesting? What were the negatives? What are the still unresolved issues? And so they go into that. So I'm not going to say anything specific. You've read it, and you might have some questions about it. And then we'll double back and go to the first thing, which is in 1960, I believe. Yeah. So in 1960, the SI was still a fairly young organization, and it was like 3 years old. And it had started off, as we know, with this kind of mix of cultural and political things, but with what we would think of as mostly cultural stuff. They're critiquing the Surrealists and talking about the Dadaists and things like that. But at the same time, ever since all through the 50s, they did have a political general perspective, which was distinctly revolutionary and not Stalinist for sure. But in those early years, it was kind of an eclectic organization. It was like, okay, we're radical artists, da da da. But what does that mean exactly? Does it mean we're Trotskyists, say, not Stalinists? Does it mean we're anarchists? Does it mean, da da da? So during this same period, starting in the late 40s and extending into the 60s, there was this group, Socialism ou Barbarie, Socialism or Barbarism, which was a kind of old socialist slogan. And that group, which was a French group that had started after World War II, was a kind of offshoot of Trotskyism. Originally, people who opposed Stalinism, but who considered themselves Marxists, sort of thought, oh, well, Trotskyism is the logical place to go there. But then they go through various things like World War II, where, and then following World War II, you have Russia taking over East Europe, and it's installing different puppet regimes. And many of the Trotskyists were coming up and saying, this is good because these are worker states, just like Trotsky called them, even though they're sort of perverted ones or defective ones. And so at that point, a lot of people who were Trotskyists said, no, wait a minute, this whole Bolshevik thing, there's something more fundamentally wrong. So they started this group that was sort of experimentally discussing, like, well, what is Russia? Where do we go? How does workers' councils fit into this, for example? And so that had been going on for about 10 years. And Debord and others were interested in that. And Debord actually attended a number of Socialism ou Barbarie meetings. And they had sent one of the issues of the SI Journal to the Socialism ou Barbarie group. And there was this one guy in the group whose pseudonym was Pierre Conjouer, and he wrote back. And so he and Debord ended up becoming pretty good friends during this period. And so they sat down in 1960 sometime over a period of several months and said, let's try to work out a joint statement. Here, you're coming from this rather traditional political group, but it's kind of open-ended. Debord is coming from this rather, avant-garde cultural group, but with a difference. And let's see where we can join together. And so they end up coming up with these theses basically about culture, art, and revolutionary politics. And how does this all fit together? And they end up, between the two of them, coming up with this thing that they jointly sign. So it's not like the SI and Socialism Barbary jointly signed, but it's kind of like that. It's like members of each of those are seeing, can we come together? Can we agree? We each see some good aspects in the other one. So this is what they end up coming up with. And it's a very rich, dense text, somewhat like the Society of the Spectacle, actually. It has, you can see the Debord elements in it, things that he later develops in that book. And I just want to note that one of the key socialism barbary theses was to, in defining classes, the class society, the traditional way to do it was to say it's the owners and the people who don't own anything. It's the rich and the poor, the capitalists and the proletariat. But socialism or Barbary, when they were faced with the existence of the Russian bureaucratic state, they were saying, well, is that capitalist or not? I mean, they can say, okay, that's sort of capitalist, but it's a state capitalist thing. It's a little different. But how do we define how the deal works there? And they said, it's not just who has the money, it's also who's the boss, who is directing things and who is just doing what they're told. And so they continually referred to the division between directors and executants, those who give orders and those who carry them out. So that theme comes up here. And then I'll just quote a brief thing here from the later theses. The relation between authors and spectators is only a transposition of the fundamental relation between directors and executants in the general society. It answers perfectly to the needs of a reified and alienated culture. Spectacle-spectator relation is in itself, a staunch bearer of the capitalist order. The ambiguity of all so-called revolutionary art lies in the fact that the revolutionary aspect of any particular spectacle is always contradicted and offset by the reactionary element present in all spectacles. So Debord will then come back to this in the next article, which is called For a Revolutionary Judgment of Art. It's 1961. And in this, there's a Socialism Barbary article about Godard's first film, Breathless, that appears in 1961, I guess, or anyway, 60 or 61. And so Debord is looking at that article, and he has some critiques of the article. So he writes this, he's looking at this that might seem to be, well, this is interesting. Socialism Barbary is looking at this film, and they're having comment on it. But Debord is saying, basically, the kind of commentary that this author is making is insufficient. It's got contradictions in it. It's sort of, it's kind of naive. And very specifically, the author is named Châtel. Debord says, Châtel thinks that if a portion of the population recognizes itself in a film, it will be able to, quote, look at itself, admire itself, criticize itself, or reject itself, in any case, to use the images that pass on the screen for its own needs, unquote. So Debord then carries on, let us first of all note that there is a certain mystery in this notion of using such a flow of images to satisfy authentic needs. Just how they are to be used is not clear. I love it when Debord just kind of steps into a situation, that might have otherwise seemed rather credible. And you say, oh, yeah, da, da, da. I mean, that's interesting. Godard shows people and da, da. And Debord says, just what is it that's being clarified here? And who is doing the clarifying? So he said, just how these images are to be used is not clear. It would first of all seem to be necessary to specify what the needs in question are in order to determine whether those images can really serve as means to satisfy them. Furthermore, everything we know about the mechanism of the spectacle, even at its simplest cinematic level, absolutely contradicts this idyllic vision of people equally free to admire or criticize themselves by recognizing themselves in the characters of a film. But most fundamentally, it is impossible to accept this division of labor between uncontrollable specialists, i.e., the people making the films, presenting a vision of people's lives to them, and audiences having to recognize themselves more or less clearly in those images. Attaining a certain accuracy in describing people's behavior is not necessarily positive. Even if Godard presents people with an image of themselves in which they can undeniably recognize themselves more than in the films of Fernandel, that's a French comic. He nevertheless presents them with a false image in which they recognize themselves falsely. Revolution is not showing life to people, but bringing them to life. A revolutionary organization must always remember that its aim is not getting its adherents to listen to convincing talks by expert leaders, but getting them to speak for themselves in order to achieve, or at least strive toward, an equal degree of participation. And then he's saying this is exactly what does not happen in the cinematic spectacle. So I'm going to then move on to the next thing, the Situationists and the new forms of action in politics and art. This is another Debord thing. In 1962, the Danish Situationist, what's his name? Martin, I forget his first name. J.V. Martin, hosted a gathering of the Situationists in Denmark who were there to kind of create a I don't know, a sort of exposition that was sort of a little more aggressive than the typical one. And in that thing, they're celebrating various new tactics. And Debord is talking, what are these new forms of action we're seeing develop? And so he gives as examples, three examples. One, in Venezuela, some Venezuelan comrades, whoever they were, he's saying we will limit ourselves to mentioning a few examples of acts that have our total approval. So he says, in January this year, some students in Caracas, Venezuela, made an armed attack on an exhibition of French art and carried off 5 paintings, which they then offered to return in exchange for the release of political prisoners. And then they list the names, and then they say, they were arrested, and then the paintings were being shipped to someplace else. And so somebody threw 2 bombs at the police thing that was transporting the paintings back to the museum or whatever, which, quote, which unfortunately did not succeed in destroying it, unquote. So Debord is saying this is a very exemplary way to create the art of the past, because the very artists like Gauguin, Van Gogh, who were represented in these paintings, had themselves, were on record as, we want to change life. I mean, we can imagine him from the grave saying, as Debord says, this is a very appropriate way to treat this, and they refer back to Bakunin. Then they go to Denmark, where somebody was throwing smoke bombs into travel agencies that were promoting vacation tours to fascist Spain. And, they were doing some other things like this. And finally, actually the most interesting one, the English comrades, namely the so-called Spies for Peace, and they refer to this thing, this was like, again, in 1962 in England, somebody discovered that, this is during a time, remember, when there's bomb shelters and fear of nuclear war and in the Cold War and all that. And somebody discovered that there was a secret bomb shelter just for the government. Like in case everybody else got blown away, the government would be safe in this, luxurious bomb shelter. And somebody discovered where that was, and of course it was top secret, and it was treason to make its location known. But suddenly everybody, thousands of people were out there making this top state secret thing known. And mimeoing the directions there or something. And so once it came out, the law became perceived as completely idiotic because everybody knew where it was by that time, but people were still getting arrested because they were giving away the secret locations. And then it just skyrocketed, snowballed, in locations of other secret things, and people started calling up the secret phone number so it couldn't receive any calls, all this. So it was a real neat thing. I also talk about it briefly in The Joy of Revolution. So Debord is giving those three examples of things that they think are, inventive, good new tactics. And then the sort of positive aspect of their thing is what we might call situationist anti-art or anti-situationist art. We have Debord's directives, which are just slogans like realize philosophy or something like this, and thermonuclear maps, which is what uh, J.V. Martin was doing, a kind of pop art, like here is Europe 10 hours after World War III starts. It shows this charred continent. And then finally, Michelle Bernstein did some pop arts victories, like correcting history, as Debord says. Like she has a pop art thing of the victory of the Paris Commune, the victory of the Bonneau gang, the victory of the medieval peasants, uprisings and things like this, as if to say, well, this is what let's look at this as if this happened. We're not pretending, obviously it didn't happen, but this is like what should have happened. So that's the end of that. And then we have on the poverty student life, which we've already discussed. And then we had these two short documents, 1965 and 69, that I won't go into. Each of them basically is just like a one-page version. What did the Situationists stand for? How do they see the world? Da da da. So you've had time to read those. So I think I'm going to now shift to Q&A. And you know, you can raise your digital hand or you can type something in the chat on any of these articles that I just skimmed here.
Well, Ken, can I
Yes.
say the description of the students in Venezuela who stole the paintings reminded me of some of the actions that took place in numerous museums, particularly in Europe, within the last year, where climate activists were trying to get attention to the issue of climate disaster by going into museums and throwing soup on some of these famous paintings. Van Gogh, I think, was the first one. They researched it first, and they made sure that they weren't actually damaging any of the paintings. But they did a number of those actions, and then finally they agreed to not do that anymore. But when I was reading this, I thought of that.
Yeah, it's somewhat the same idea. It's like, again, to go back to that Paris Commune piece, we had that case in the Paris Commune where, when it looked like the commune was doomed, the Versailles army was coming in, and thousands of people realized we're dead. We're going to get shot. Do we have a parting thing? And somebody comes and says, let's burn down Notre Dame. And they try to do that. I mean, they intend to do that, but they're stopped by other communards who say, no, this is our heritage, or something. It's obviously not a simple question, but the way that the three situationists put it, they don't say, which is the right side, but they say this is an interesting question of the sort that direct democracy will have to deal with.
Yeah.
It's an example of that. Like, you have these strong views about something, and they can conflict. But the hint is that, look, if your society can think of nothing better to do than kill you because you're trying to improve things, are you going to say, okay, I'll die for Notre Dame because it's a pretty building? And it's yeah, you think, well, wait a minute. I mean, your thought is, let's have some priorities here. Is a fucking building more important than, the 10,000 people that are going to be shot right now? I mean, because that building, it's not just a building. It's a building that the people who are going to shoot you are going to worship in and take pride in. It's France's glory and glory of God and all this kind of thing. And are you going to, so you can see it's, can be a tricky thing there. But the point is that, you're kind of hitting a tender spot
Yeah.
if you do these things, because, let's move on. Ed Matthews, unmute yourself.
Muted myself. I think we mentioned this book before, but I just wanted to point it out again. For anybody that wants to know more about the Paris Commune, this book by Kristen Ross, The Emergence of Social Space, Rimbaud and the Paris Commune. Excellent book that really provides a lot more detailed background to make sense of some of the commentary that the SI have made on the Paris Commune, their interest in it. And one of the lines in that short piece is about revolutionary being fun, right? There was a festival atmosphere, there's festivities. And in this book, the Situationists of May 68, the book ends with reminding the reader about the same idea was at work in 1968, the idea that revolution can be fun. It can be playful. And the joy of revolution, right, as your book is entitled, really permeates both the Paris Commune and then the ideas of 68, the fact that there is the possibility that revolution can be fun. The other very quick point in the other essay, New Forms of Action in Politics and Art, there's a line around the top of 406 where he writes, a critical art can be carried out within the existing means of cultural expressions from cinema to painting, even though we ultimately wish to destroy this entire artistic framework. Well, a short time ago, I was reading Walter Benjamin, and in this book, Reflections, is his essay on surrealism. And there's a line in here where he talks about, stated more briefly and dialectically, this, meaning the surrealists, this means that the sphere of poetry was here explored from within by a closely knit circle of people pushing the poetic life to its utmost limits of possibility. Well, it turns out, speaking of translations, that the word explore is incorrect. What the word actually is exploded. So the idea of not only transcending art, but making it explosive and dangerous, what Benjamin actually said was more succinctly and dialectically put, this means that here the realm of poetry was exploded from within. And what he was talking about was the symbolists, their work sort of laying dormant for a period of time, and the surrealists rediscovering it and having, again, this explosive sort of detonation within culture. So the notion of, in a sense, blowing things up from within, from inside, is again a theme that I found quite surprising with Benjamin. But the idea is there, this idea that from within, you can create art that will not only disturb, but literally, threaten the very system. And that line that says destroy the entire artistic framework, that is certainly one way to transcend art. But here's Benjamin writing in the 1920s, something very, very similar.
Okay, any other comments or questions about the text we looked through here? Sid, unmute yourself.
At the very beginning of of the reading, page 387,
Mm-hmm.
paragraph 2, I just have a question. I just don't understand what they're saying. I understand where it says all forms of capitalist society are in the final analysis based on the generalized stable division between directors and executives, et cetera. Between understanding and doing, that's pretty clear to me. This part, the inability to organize, on the basis of permanent exploitation, the continually accelerating domination of nature toward any goal whatsoever.
Okay.
I have no idea what that means.
Yeah. Okay. So we have this division between the order givers and the order takers, which is clear enough. If you transpose this into culture, remember, this isn't just art. It includes things like science, knowledge, education, things like this. If you transfer that difference, like instead of the factory boss to the assembly line worker, and you get these other analogous distinctions of the top and the bottom person, the top would be understanding, the people at the top who supposedly understand things, and the people underneath who supposedly do things. But the problem is, like in a factory, if the people are bossing the workers around, it works. The workers make an automobile or some product, and it's sold, and the people at the top make a lot of money. They have a task and they do it. But if we talk more generally, like in education or culture or ideologies, things like this, the cultural domain, the people at the top, we have the inability to organize the continually accelerating domination of nature toward any goal whatsoever. So kind of leave out that parenthetical, and it's a little easier to understand. The people at the top who are like the ideologues or the advisors or whoever is coming up with these global schemes, that we're going to put our efforts in doing this, since they are locked into this thing, like they can't just decide, oh, we're going to do this, because they too are victims of, see, what's going on is that nature is being dominated. New technologies keep coming in that, do stuff that we usually used to have to do by hand. But when the people at the top are saying, oh, well, let's make that go farther, the problem is that it doesn't work like making a car or raising food or something like that. The people at the top are stuck in this project that is nonsense. That's where, like, the understanding people are unable to organize on the basis of permanent exploitation. See, that's where they're stuck. They're trapped there. Because if there's not permanent ongoing exploitation, then the whole system collapses. Capitalism goes away. So you have to keep exploiting people. But if you keep exploiting people, you find that what is the goal here? Where are you going? You know, you can individually, somebody can make some temporary profits or something, or you can temporarily have a coup, take power. But if you look at the whole picture, it's like, what are they going to do? Imagine if you were in that position that you could just press buttons and people would do what you wanted, but you're trying to keep people still going to the factories. You're trying to keep profits still going to the companies. So what are you going to do? Meanwhile, the climate is falling apart. You know, there's all this other stuff. And so you say, oh, well, maybe we can put some of this into, you know, tamping down climate change or something. Well, yeah, maybe you could do it. But if you do that, you know, is it profitable? Well, no. Or maybe, so that's the contradiction they're talking about. You know, it's the contradiction that Marx pointed out. Like, you know, if you're a capitalist, you end up competing with other capitalists, and then you try to raise this, but you try to lower that at the same time. Debord and Kenjou are just saying, in the same way, the people in the cultural or education or ideological zone are stuck in the same way. You know, and we'll go into that in Society of the Spectacle, because there will be a whole chapter about, you know, how the spectacle divides and yet it unifies, and you know, the people trying to unify are divided, and etc.
So somehow stuck in their own contradiction,
Yeah,
perhaps.
yeah. It's like, you may say, oh, they're defeating the workers or the proletariat or something, but yeah, what have they got? You know, where, you know, it's like the ship that they're trying to commandeer is heading to an iceberg. It's like the Titanic. And they have the privilege of saying, move those deck chairs around and do this, you know, but they don't have the privilege or the possibility of saying, hey, full speed back. You know, because to say full speed back would crash their system. You know, so they don't know what to do. Do we veer it away from this? You know, well, let's veer it over to the left. No, let's veer it over to the right. You know, it's like that. Like, if they were able to see what was going on, they would give up. It's like, where is this going?
Yeah, or change their minds, maybe.
Yeah.
I do.
Okay, Ed Stress.
Yeah, hi everybody. Happy birthday, Ken. That was fun. Um, I think this really comes up with graduate students, because when the undergraduates they don't understand, you know, where everything is. But you know, I mean, where's the National Science Foundation grant money coming from? I mean, there's a noble idea of we're going to give this money to places that will benefit society, and we have to investigate all these science things and all these technological things, and some of which will help us maybe, and some of which will definitely damage us, and some of them are ambiguous. But then I don't think it's kind of noblesse oblige, where, I mean, it depends on the status of some people that are appointed to decide which ones are best and make up the criteria. It's all done by humans. And I don't think the left has as much of an idea of the mechanism of that as the right does, I suspect. So, I mean, they haven't been very successful, but they might be.
Yeah.
Um,
Okay, I think we'd better move on here because we're almost halfway through the thing. The next thing we have is these internal texts. Um, let's see here. There were the provisional statutes of the SI, which goes into detail about the different groupings of the SI, if they can or are unable to have a national thing. Like in the past, the SI had gone through various things like did they have different national groupings or cultural groupings or something? It's because they're an international organization. And so in 1969, after May 68, where they're kind of consolidating, what's been going on here, and we're ready to move on to new things, they, come up with these provisional statutes, notice, and talk about how they work, how they would do their relations with each other and coordinations. And then we have some internal letters to each other. The first one is some selections from Paolo Salvadori, one of the Italian people who came in 1969. And he has some very interesting, this is just excerpts from a much longer letter. I just picked out some of the high points. Basically, he's saying, okay, we've come through May 68, there's all these but we got all kinds of projects here and possibilities. And so I'm going to take it on me to just throw out some things that we need to consider, and he mentions the project or the idea of having a situationist manifesto, like Marx and Engels had a communist manifesto in kind of analogous situations. And then he distinguishes that from Rene Vianney's proposal of having a wildcat strikers handbook, something that you could, bring in these basics, that, and actually Vanagem later on ended up writing something sort of along that line. And then another project is, sort of reviewing the past revolutions, which he notes that chapter 4 in the Society of the Spectacle does exactly that, but he's just saying we need to go further in this, go into more detail. And of course, the Rizal article that we looked at the last time about workers' councils does some of the same ideas. So anyway, he's throwing out these things as just for people to think about. And then there's a long piece that, again, I just excerpted by Debord, Remarks on the SI Today. And he says, I agree with this text, except for blah, 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 and it goes through. But Debord is saying, okay, we've got a lot of good things here, but he starts saying, nevertheless, I am sensing at this point, after several months of this discussion that we've been having, that there's some kind of, you know, people are talking a good talk and they're not really coming up with original good idea, practical ideas. You know, they're just sort of weighing in there so that people can say, oh, so-and-so is taking part. He's radical, he's something. And so Debord is responding to this. All these monologues are scarcely being used to clarify what I mean regarding this underuse of theory, just as Magritte could paint a pipe and then correctly write on the painting, this is not a pipe. To declare that one does not separate theory and practice is not yet to practice theory. And putting revolutionary theory into practice is not at all messianically postponed until the victory of the revolution. It is required throughout the entire process of revolutionary activity. And he says, even to formulate the most general revolutionary theory is inconceivable without a very precise practice, and vice versa. Even in a street fight, you still have to think. You know, you can't just isolate it and say, okay, it's just time for. But if we leave aside these dialectical truisms on extreme cases, we consider the most common concrete situation in which dialecticians, which is what they or would be, reveal themselves as such, even if many of them don't have the intellectual background enabling them to talk about dialectics or to write theory at the dialectical level. So then Debord goes into this kind of neat little vignette to see, it says, let's get back to basics here. People meet each other. They talk about how they understand the world and what they think they really, what they think here, what they think they can do in it. They judge each other while judging their world, and each judges the judgments of the others. They agree with or oppose each other's projects. If there is a common project, they have to know at different moments what this project has become. It may have started out great, and then suddenly it's a mess. It's a drag. Their success or failure is measured by practice and their consciousness of practice. It's not just what they do, but what they are aware of having done. They may themselves, rightly or wrongly, characterize their failures and successes as secondary or decisive. The result may later be reversed, and they may be aware of this, or they may have forgotten it, etc., etc. In other words, it is in this concerted and theorized action, which is also theory tested in action, that revolutionary dialecticians have to recognize as well as possible the decisive elements of a complex problem, and probable or modifiable by them interaction of these elements, and so on. So this is the territory of the qualitative, where individuals, their acts, meaning, and life know each other, and where it is necessary to know how to know. The presence of history in the everyday life of revolutionaries. You comrades will certainly say that the preceding lines are very banal, and this is quite true. So he goes on. So I'm going to go on through there, but I like where he comes back and says, basically, what are we doing here? You know, we're in this group. This group in the 1950s had a certain project, and we did it. We made mistakes. We had some great victories, you know, real coups that we carried out, like the Strasbourg scandal and so on. But we can't just sit on that. We now have to say, well, where are we now? Because one thing we don't want to do is sit around congratulating ourselves because we ended up contributing to provoking the May 68 revolt. which is a huge thing, definitely. But if you can imagine that many groups, if they had done a tenth that much, would have been parading that, like, hey, we're the ones that were there, and here's a picture of me, storming the barricade, and here's what I wrote and all this. We're the cool group. These other people didn't realize this stuff. And you have to realize that somebody like Lenin could have claimed the same thing. He said, like, when he was an underground guy, he looked pretty good. And he wrote a lot of decisive things and, da da da. But then Lenin and his group come to the top, and suddenly they're worse than nothing. It's not as if they even faded away, into old codgers reminiscing. It's so Debord, above all, does not want that to happen. And before he would want that to happen, he would destroy the SI. So he's talking perhaps more than some of the other members, more disinterestedly. It's like Debord himself is quite capable of doing all sorts of stuff. Maybe some of the other members aren't. Maybe they need the group, to kind of they can rally and do something together, all this. Anyway, he doesn't want the group to settle into this kind of complacency. So that's what a lot of his theses here are about. He's criticizing some things where, rhetoric is sounding good, but let's see. And so in that next text, we have this declaration signed by him, Rizal, and Vianney, saying, and this will seem pretty abstract probably, but you just have to say, they're saying, look, we already a month ago we're talking about this, and it's the same thing going on. We want to see, the nuts and bolts here. And so as a result of that, Vanagem, among others, resigned from the SI. So that's a whole different thing, which I won't go into. But in other words, some implication is that they were saying, Vanagem, you were one of the stars of the earlier period here, and now you were becoming more and more just sort of cotton candy rhetoric. Then in the last text, after Vanagem and some of the others have left, other people, and all that, he's saying, like, when the SI is reduced to virtually, like 4 or 5 people, he's saying, okay, we've managed to destroy the SI here. And what he and Sanguinetti did the following year, 1972, is that they wrote a book called The Real Split in the International, which in large part talks about the SI and all these things. The role of the SI in May 68, the role of, workers' councils, all these different things, and the post May 68 period, where you had this sudden thousands of people want to join the SI, and the SI accepts none of them. But they're trying to figure out how do we juggle this? Do we want to be this key thing that is, adored by thousands of people that would like to imitate us or be part of us or something? And so what they ended up doing is in that book that he and Sanguinetti wrote, they end up attacking viciously, ruthlessly, those followers. More than, I mean, they're still talking about Stalinists and, blah, blah, blah. But they really lay into these people that any other radical group would have said, oh, yeah, come on and join us. You can hand out our leaflets for us. You can donate for this. They told them, fuck off. You are the lowest of the low. You are pathetic. You saw us do something and you could only make stars out of us, you idiots. So that's kind of how the SI ended. And then Debord went off to his own things. And some of the other members went off to do their own things, for good or ill. So that's how that ended. And I think so we can talk about that at this point. And I think just we can look ahead to the blind men and the elephant thing, if you remember some of the kind of reactions they were getting, because that's sort of part of the same deal here, the same phenomena. You see all these confusions, all these adulations. Oh, he's so great. Oh, these people are demons. They're so horrible. All this kind of crazy reaction that Debord in particular, but maybe some of the other situationists to some extent, were agreed, you know, like we have to kill that. You know, I mean, we can't continue to exist, you know, as if nothing's happening and we're happy to have your subscriptions and, you know, you can do this stuff. So they went out with a big bang, and such that, you know, well, the sequel is another question. So any comments or questions about these internal texts or the reactions? Let's let Zach unmute yourself, please.
Hi.
Hi.
Yeah, so I've always found the whole orientation debate material, you know, incredibly depressing, and I think it may be a mistake to sort of whitewash what was going on here. It sort of represents a complete and total failure of organization, and it represents first the denial and then the inability to acknowledge that, in complete contrast to the theory of organization, which was this was a group of equals all participating equally. You know, there was a charismatic leader, and that was Debord. And there was, by Debord's own account, this huge failure of participation and the inability of other members of the group to participate in a way that he found satisfactory. And my sense is that this goes back to the inability to come up with a structure for the group that would facilitate participation, that would make it possible, that would encourage it, as opposed to what actually seemed to happen, which is everybody every time someone tries to participate, they get slapped down and insulted. And I was curious if you had any thoughts about this, that there's supposed to be the structure which allowed for tendencies for people to, who disagreed with sort of, an official position on something or a developing position, to come up with a way of constructively presenting an alternative. In reality, that never really happened. A couple of people tried to create tendencies, but it didn't result in any constructive discussion about different positions. It basically ended in the people with the alternative tendencies being kicked out not because of the ideas ostensibly, but because of inadequacies of their personal behavior. It became personalized. And I'm just curious if you see any other way that this could possibly have developed, whether there was some alternative structure, some alternative way of the participation could have been enabled in this.
I was just going to ask you the same thing.
I wasn't there.
Yeah.
But yes, I mean, one of the issues, as Debord himself realized, was that he had become the leader, and people were simply sitting back and waiting for him to do stuff. And as he said, when he gave up the editorship of the journal, they never succeeded in creating another journal. No, that was it. There was no one was able to step in and replace him. I think one of the issues is that, and again, this becomes a matter of personalities, and without knowing these people, it's so hard to know. But Debord was unable to step back, I think, and acknowledge the issues, the problems that he was having in this group, with this group. That he was a control freak who didn't want to exercise control, but when other people started doing things, he immediately would find fault and try and step in and correct them. There was an inability to let go and let this group potentially develop in directions that he might not have been entirely comfortable with, but which nonetheless would have been some sort of evolution and led to some kind of new process, new situation. For a group that claimed to be dialectical, it was incredibly undialectical because you never allowed any kind of counter thesis to develop, which you could then synthesize with the existing
Well,
thesis and
I
come up with something new.
think if you look in more detail, maybe the anthology, I'm picking out the more interesting articles. But if you read all the articles, which many people, you will find, especially in the early and middle period, quite diverse articles. I mean, you would almost say, is this article appearing in a situationist thing? Because it's just going into, something about the thing of theater with, you can see it's sort of in the same thing. They're talking about spectacles and art, but, there's, people come up with these things that a year later, you don't hear of it again. And it's not because the people necessarily got kicked out or something, but it's just that it didn't, it didn't prove fruitful. Whereas somebody else, maybe not necessarily in a signed article or something, but somebody in their group discussions maybe had come up with a good idea and it just took 30 seconds to say that. And then they did that. And they didn't mull over it too much. They didn't go back and say, oh, this is all crap that we did before, but there was that kind of change. I mean, if you go through issues 1 through 9 or so, there's quite, they're going all over the place. And as Debord said, those earlier issues were, as he says, the first 6 or 7 issues were satisfactory. Yeah, were the first 5 issues or something were really collective. I mean, you got a dozen people or however many were there, and they really, people contributed different things. They wrote joint articles, unsigned, and all kinds of things like that, and all that. And then he said something like 6 through 9 was sufficiently collective. In this case, he said that mostly 3 of us doing it, but we're a small group. It's not like you have to have every person do, it was a joint effort. So he's saying that's the first, more than half of the SI is there. And Debord is right in there. There have been some breaks and exclusions and all that, but it's not because, like you were saying, that he was just kicking out anybody that was off on a different thing. There were a lot of different things in there. But where Debord really came in is that he judged, and I think in most cases rightly, there could be some disagreement, that, okay, at this point, like when they're founding the SI, 1957, it's all artists practically, and here they're talking about superseding art and so on. But the idea is like, hey, we're experimenting, we're exploring this, we're exchanging. There was a guy who thought there could be some situationist music because he was a musician, and somebody else was going to do, and they didn't rule that out. It's just like that guy would have to come up with something pretty credible. You don't just say that like that you're going to blur everything into a situationist something or other. So at a certain point where they decide, at this point, maybe in 1959, 1960 or something, they're coming into like a commercialization of some of the art or this, and they decide, where are we going to draw the line here? This is getting kind of fuzzy. And so, they'll draw a line, even though it wasn't like 2 architects were excluded in 1959, I think, because they contracted to design a church. And for the Situationists, this was just, disgusting. I mean, for somebody else, most architects, oh, okay, what do you want? They would just do it. But for the Situationists, they thought that's just too much. You're out. But I don't know that they had a rule about that. It's just that it kind of made sense to say, you guys are not in the, we're not going down that path. That's ridiculous. So they kicked them out. Uh, so I mean, Debord is seeing these different things happen, and at a certain point, he has to say, look, we can't put up with this. That's my position. If you guys agree, then I'm leaving. Or, you know, at other points, there were a lot of stuff heavily debated for years, and they were still all in the same group. And you could say, oh, this person's personality is this, or that guy tends to have ideas sort of skewed over that way or something, but they tolerated each other pretty much. And it was only when they get to a point where they're saying, look, this is, now, I'm not defending all the things that they did, but I think the idea was that we are a tiny group. We're not trying to become 50 people or 500 people. Never. What we're trying to do is carry out a project. And the project, I mean, you could do it with just one person, but it makes more sense that it's with a sprinkling of people in different countries from different, perspectives and that kind of thing. We're trying to create a critique of the global system and how to get out of it. So that's a very specific thing as well as a very general thing. And it doesn't really matter if somebody's feelings are hurt because they did that. Because if somebody's kicked out, they're quite free to go on and do their own thing. And a lot of them did. Like if you have something to do, a project, and the Situationists say that's it, well, you can go off and do that project. Nobody's stopping you. And in a few cases, they did go on to do stuff, but in most cases, you can see in retrospect, they went on to do stuff that really doesn't have much radicality to it. They ended up going back to just traditional radical groups or just traditional art, even if it was kind of avant-garde. And if that was all the Situationists did, we wouldn't be talking about them now, 50 years later. We're talking about them because they did take these chances, and they took a chance to say, we may be wrong, but in our view, this is unacceptable, you're out. And then we are going to proceed with less interference of, without having to try to convince you or you're dragging your feet or whatever. So they do that, and what happens from it? Strasbourg. And they continue to do that, and what happens? May 68. So apparently that organization, which any outsider looking at it would say, this organization had 12 people and now it has 7. Great organization, huh? They're used to political parties and all this. That had nothing to do with anything, or rather, it did have something to do with it. Maybe those 5 people that were kicked out would have impeded things. The people that were there, the 3 or 4 or 7 people or whoever, were enough to do what they did, which is bring a country to a standstill. So then when that happens, and suddenly people are saying, hey, who started this? Well, Situationist slogans, blah, blah, blah. And then suddenly a lot of people become aware, these Situationists, these strange people. And then a lot of people want to join them. They want to praise them. Other people are denouncing them, all this kind of thing. And they're in the middle of this thing that almost nobody ever has to face. The people that have to face it are people that want to be in it, like movie stars and star singers and that kind of thing. They want to be but the SI was not, what the SI wanted to do is to change the world. And they succeeded in these very promising kind of things. And then suddenly there's this flood of stuff. What would you do? Like if you're a group of a dozen people and suddenly 1,000 people want to join you. you know, do you say, well, let's see, we'll have a, you know, what they ended up doing is temporarily, they just didn't have anybody join, you know, because that wasn't really the point. And they were very dubious about, you know, what would it be like if even 10 or 20 had joined under those circumstances, those 10 or 20 would have almost inevitably become, you know, apprentices. You know, I mean, you're there and then you're blown out by Debord or maybe Vanagem or some of these, a few of these other people who you've heard about, read their books, and you know, they could get away with anything. You know, it's a ridiculous situation to be in where they want to be in a situation where they're not bossing people around, the Situationists. And here suddenly people are offering them the chance to boss 1,000 people around and to capitalize on it. They could have become rich. They could have, you know, done practically anything you can think of. I mean, you know, get contracts. I mean, who knows what all. So in that situation, you have to look at, like Debord is looking at this more than the other members, I think. And he's saying, he's taking the long view, you know, like what's going to happen a decade or two from now. And he's saying that this is not the way, you know, we've triggered this and now we want it to go out of our control. That's right where it should be. And they even quote, there's a biblical saying something about we have sown the, I don't know, the tempest, we will reap the
The whirlwind.
or so, yeah, you know, I forget what it is, you know, and that's what they wanted to do, and it's what they didn't do. You know, so basically, Debord did what I've never heard of any other group doing of that nature. It's like he got to the high point and then he destroyed it. I mean, it would be like somebody, you know, wanting to be a star and then committing suicide on TV or something. You know, it's like, what? Wait a minute. You're just ready to you could capitalize on this. And he didn't want to capitalize on it because the so-called capitalizing would be literally capitalizing. You know, it would be like becoming part of the system. And, you know, we have to be part of the system to some extent, but there was a choice that Debord and the others had, and they can choose not to go on with the flow. You know, when they see something that's fucked up, they can say, okay, we did a good thing here, and now we're stopping it. You go off and do what you feel like doing, folks. And that's basically what happened. I mean, you can then, you know, kind of nitpick and say, well, Debord's personality was this, or this exclusion sounds kind of nasty and it was based on personal this or that. And maybe so in some cases. But you have to think like, again, just think of any other group. Like, did the Bolsheviks build up a big organization and then you know, dissolved themselves in 1917? No, they built up a bigger organization by adding on the police and stuff. You know, that's another extreme. But you know, when surrealism became fashionable, you know, you look at, well, what did the surrealists do? Actually, they were somewhat like the Situationists. They did, like Breton and the others, they did do these nasty exclusions at certain points because they thought, we don't want this person, you know. So I've yacked away there, but it's just, I can't see that a group that sets itself the thing to change the world and it ends up provoking, you know, May 68, which no other group has ever even come close to doing, that you say, well, that organization failed.
If I can just push back a little bit, and I don't want
Yeah.
to take up too much time here, I certainly wasn't saying that the SI failed. But I do think that the way that they ended represented a failure for them. I think what you, and again, I wasn't talking specifically about the exclusions or a decision to not admit new members. I mean, I see valid reasons for all of those things. But I think what you're leaving out of account here is that they didn't necessarily dissolve by choice. They spent the last 2 years of their existence bemoaning the fact that there was a complete inadequacy of participation within the organization. Participation being really perhaps the highest goal, the goal of the world that they wanted to create was a world in which people participated.
Yeah.
And yet within their own group, Debord and everyone else keeps repeating and repeating, we're not participating adequately. You're not participating adequately. He's not participating adequately. It's not working. And I think trying to understand why there was that failure of participation would be valuable. And it's something I've thought about a chunk, and I'm certainly don't say that I have any answer to it, but I think it's a question that is worth foregrounding a little bit. Why this group of select people who, as you say, had been winnowed down to sort of this hardcore was at the end unable to do what they hoped to do, and ended up having to disband.
Well,
despite all of the amazing
Yeah.
successes that they had
Yeah.
had and the amazing accomplishments, that's not to in any way.
well, in the last article that Debord, the untitled text that Debord wrote, he has a thing where he's looking back, and on previous radical groups, and he's saying the process of alienation gone through by various past emancipatory endeavors, from the Communist League, that was like 1849, etc., to the FI, the Iberian Anarchist Federation, or even, if this comparison should be invoked in our case, surrealism, was followed by the SI in all its easily recognizable forms. So he's pointing out that all these great, super important things of the past, I mean, those three are certainly immensely important. The one was the thing that Marx founded. The other was the greatest anarchist, group ever in existence, numerically, et cetera, and surrealism, all that. He's saying that invariably these groups end up, aging. And it's, like, if you say, how would they elicit more participation? There's only so much you can do. Like, people get tired, they get bored, they get old, they get jealous of each other, they get too big for their britches. They think they're the greatest thing because they wrote a book, or because they were on top of the podium at some key moment or something. And it's just that happens all the time. It's almost unrealistic. And Debord even said about when he was looking back much later on Breton, he said, Breton, here was the guy that, was sort of the Debord of surrealism, if you want to put it that way, or vice versa. He was the guy who was the key, guy, But Debord said, he was the boss, he was the head, the leader for like more than 30, 40 years. He said, and Debord says, that's too much. And he wasn't saying, and he could point to things like, well, Breton was more fuzzy-headed when he was in the 50s than in the 20s, or something. But basically, he's just saying things age. Like, if you've got a group and you have the same leader, I mean, leaders exist. You have the same, but you have the same leader for 40 years. I mean, come on, that's weird. That would have to be very bizarre. The normal procedure is that after a little while, younger blood comes in and they boot out the older fuddy-duddies, and come in, for good or ill, but that's how things work. And so Debord is pointing out that this is only to be expected. And he does in his last film, where he also kind of goes through this thing briefly. He he presents these things like the charge of the Light Brigade is in the film. Maybe that's partly in Society of the Spectacle film too. But in both cases, I think in the last film, he's saying, here's this film of the charge, you know, and then everybody gets killed. And then, okay, it's like a Civil War film. It's not that charge, you know, and so you have the same general charge, you know, and another brigade, and this keeps going through there. And Debord kind of comically is uh, suggesting that he's like that general that except that he's on the front line of each of the charges. You know, he's not sending the other people, and that he kind of prides himself that the groupings that he led all destroyed themselves. And he says, as should be as it should be. You don't want somebody that's hanging around to collect accolades, you know, when they're 80 years old or something, like when I'm going to be sometime pretty soon. Yeah, you know, you want, at least Debord kind of likes the idea that you go in there and you burn yourself up. You know, you put your all into it. If you're a little group and you're saying, we're going to do anything to change the world, and then you do a little stuff and then you retire. Yeah. But you're still having the labels and you're still the head of a group or so. You know, he's saying that this is, you know, he's poking fun at and criticism at other people that typically do that in cultural as well as political things. You know, oh, that person's got the Nobel Prize and then they can do this. And so I mean, if there was a way, you're saying how to get people to participate, I was in groups that were kind of like the SI that we formed back in the 70s. And, you know, to us, I mean, we were facing the same kind of things that Debord faced, you know, namely, I mean, there were inequalities. Somebody wasn't a very good writer, and we were trying to write a pamphlet like on the poverty or something like that, you know, so one or two people would end up doing most of that, but that's okay to a certain extent. You know, other people have other assets, you know, they may be good at whatever, but to juggle that so that there's not a sort of permanent distinction, like these are the guys who think and these are the guys who hand out the leaflets or man the barricades or something. You know, so we would have loved, you know, to have people, you know, more participants, but that was the point, participants. We already were pretty selective because we were sort of imitating the SI. Like in a group I was in, we had started out with 5 members, and at one point later we added one more. And then 2 years later we dissolved our group because we were all getting depressed and OD'd, you know, for various reasons. And I wrote a whole pamphlet about that. But the point is, it's like we could have argued like, and I did a little bit retrospectively say, well, maybe if we had organized that writing project a little differently, we could have just gotten it on and then moved on. But we sort of diddled around with it too long and we got OD'd by it or something. So you could say there's some things like that, but there's some things that just happen. You know, like partly while we were writing this, the thing we were writing about was dying. We were writing a critique of the radical movement in the America, and the radical movement ended up, you know, committing suicide in rival Maoist sects and Weathermen, you know, these crazy sorts of things. And after a point, you know, it was obsolete. Like we should have just struck while the iron was hot, and just done it. But we were new at it, and we didn't know, and so we would try something and then we learned some other, and so then we'd go back and rewrite it and think, no, that's not how so the same kind of abortive projects were in the SI, things that you've never heard of, because they were a project that somebody had an idea to write a book about something and it never happened. Who knows? He might have spent thousands of hours trying to write a book, but it just didn't pan out. And somebody else has another project here or things. So a lot of those things are going on, including a lot of unfinished things that Debord never realized. We can see now in retrospect his notes for things that he planned to do. And then at a certain point, he just tossed them out. He said, well, that's dated now, move on to something else. So it's just, yeah, there's a lot of things about the SI. When you look at it, you can say, well, what would I have done differently in that position? And there may have been things that could have been done differently, but I don't know what they are exactly. It's kind of hard to, I mean, I wrote a pamphlet, that my religion pamphlet, that did have a critique of the situationist milieu that might have a slight bearing on what you're talking about. And I said that because of that religious blind spot, to my mind, that they had, that kind of affects interpersonal relations and different stuff like that. So I came in with my little 2 bits worth, in the late 70s, saying I think that this might have been a factor in some of these, in the hostility of the breaks and the delirium that entered into some of these post-SI things. But it's there's a few people who have made critiques like that, but the vast majority of them are just like, they're just saying, oh, they should have done something different, or why didn't they? And I very rarely, if ever, see what should they have done differently. What would you do if you were Debord? I mean, to my mind, if I had been in 1971 and said, what should Debord do? It wouldn't have occurred to me to say, destroy the SI. But that's what he did. And in retrospect, it was brilliant. It was courageous, and it was almost the imagination to think to do that. I don't want to exaggerate. I mean, he had certain choices. The alternatives, my point is that the alternatives were not good. I mean, if he had hung in there with a few people into the 80s, oh, there's that little Situationist International group. What are they going to do to, maybe they could have written some interesting things, but it would have been kind of silly. It would have been a real, it would have started getting like Elvis sightings or something. Yeah, it would have almost invariably become a sort of star thing, that people would have speculated about. And even when Debord was on his own, it was that to some extent. But as long as he had destroyed the organization, there wasn't too much people could say. Then they just had to focus just on him and say, it's all your fault, that the world hasn't changed or something. Yeah. So I'm sorry to ramble on, but I hope that some of my ramblings are suggestive.
Ed had
Ed Matthews.
yeah.
Yeah, hi. Just a couple of ideas that popped into my head as both you and Zach were talking. The first one is from the biography on Debord by Ansel Jaap. And he mentions at one point how he considered Debord to be very much like André Breton, in the sense that they were excluding people in order to keep that group white hot, right? To keep it functioning on the highest level. And they found that people that started to quote unquote slack off would then dull some of that fire. That's one of the reasons why we see those expulsions, and of course the group getting smaller and smaller. There's also, and Ken, I know you don't mention it in any of the essays here, but there was an ill-fated issue 13 that Debord had worked on or tried to work on. And again, to Zach's point, he mentions that there seemed to be less and less participation. And this was exactly the reason why the issue never came to fruition. They worked on this thing, I think, over a year, and the ideas were tentative at best. And so he finally realized, no, that's not going to work because there's a certain standard we need to maintain. It isn't as good as what we had made before. Things are much more focused on politics. That was another issue. And then there's this kind of ironic stance between the pro situs, right, being morons. I got an SI t-shirt. That's all I need. And yet at the same time, Debord also saying, as he says here, that the situationist movement in the broad sense of the word is now diffused more or less everywhere, as if to say that, and he mentions this in a few letters around the same time, that you just need to get the ideas out there. Let people use those ideas. Don't tell them how. Put the ideas out there, and they will begin to work on their own under new historical conditions. So we have, on the one hand, the pro situs that didn't get it at the time the SI were around, but then the idea that if the theory is there, people will come back to it at a later date and make sense of it because new conditions have arisen. And I think that's why he refers to the SI as being like radioactivity, that he says in the fourth edition, the Italian edition of Society of the Spectacle, that it radiates you, you can feel it. And sometimes when people do certain things, they're not aware of where it came from. And when you point it out, oh, okay, my different way or my desire to live a different way, that's where it came from. And that's kind of the way I see the end being the way it is, and almost not inexorable, but it certainly was an understandable way to end the SI at the time that he did, because also coming up in the early 70s were all kinds of much more dangerous political events like terrorism. There were environmental concerns, there was feminism, there were new ideas, new concerns that I don't think were part of the rubric that the SI had considered at the time. So rather than try to, continue and feel out of date, just end it. And so that, and then finally, the last part is even the members themselves after 1968 felt that they themselves were being co-opted and becoming themselves a spectacle. There's the nostalgia of 68. There's the nostalgia of the old SI. And again, once you become a spectacle, you're no longer operating on the same level as you were before. So just to add to Zach's points, but I wanted to let you finish before introducing these new ideas.
Yeah.
But no, it's looks on the surface unusual and perhaps reckless, but I think it was a very smart, calculated move on Debord's part, because at the end he was practically the only member left. He put together the last three issues.
Yeah. Thanks. Sid, I think you had your hand raised, and then did you just decide to lower it? You need to unmute yourself.
Yeah, I forgot what it was, but thank you, Ed. That was interesting. Oh, I remember now. Ken, you said something about something with respect to religion, and I know my understanding is that the board and the Situationists were totally against religion. Did you have a critique of that?
Yes. Yeah, I wrote a small pamphlet about it. It took me quite a while because actually it took some guts, because to do that, I was like plunging into something that the European situationists and practically all European radicals, when you even mention that, they say, oh, forget it. The Catholic Church, that's the epitome, and so I'll put it's on my website. It's called The Realization and Suppression of Religion.
Yeah.
I start out by saying that the Situationists had this thing about the realization and suppression of art, where it's like they're critiquing art, and they could even say art is dead, but they're also praising art, like art is sort of the realm of creativity. And so you can, there's kind of a dialectical thing going on there. And I was saying that I suggested that one might do the same thing about religion. You can say religion is bullshit, it's full of horrible things, blah, blah, blah. But it's also a terrain of community, ethics, spiritual, different things like that. And by sort of woodenly being, like the Voltaire kind of person or something that's just it doesn't see anything there, it's a terrain where valuable things have been expressed over history. And so and I think for us in America, this is a more obvious thing than in Europe, because we are used to the idea of religion in America being a grab bag of 1,000 different sects. You sort of do what feels right or something, whereas Europe is more used to the Catholic Church and the Inquisition and things like this. That's kind of their picture. So we have more the sense like, well, where does religion, does Zen count? Is yoga a religion? Do we things like this? Is psychoanalysis a religion? And you can see there. Anyway, I wrote that as a situationist type of person who had been through all these traumatic things that people do bring up about breaks and about, you get burned out or, and whatever. And I just thought that, I had some things to say about that. And the result was a few people still don't speak to me. And that was like 40 years ago, more than 40 years ago. But many others, because I had some situationist cred, I had, people, some of my writings had been translated into French and all that kind of thing. And obviously I knew all about the Situationists. I wasn't just some naive idiot, coming in to say anything. People would read it and they would say, well, yeah, there is sort of something you have to say here, but do you have to use the word religion? And it became sort of obvious, like it's a fetish. They couldn't stand, that you would say a good thing about religion, because that was supposed to. And so I said, that's an example of what I'm talking about. This means that there could be various ideas, there could be various actions that you might be advised to look into, and you won't because it's forbidden, it's taboo.
Interesting.
So yeah, I did have that to say, and that may have some relevance to where people critique certain aspects of Debord's personality or the the vehemence of some of the breaks or things like that. But I resist saying like, well, that I was telling the Situationists to be more mellow or something. Yeah, that's not it really. I was just pointing out some things that even by their own standards, they should be able to see. And it happens, there were people that back there, like I say, they wouldn't have exchanged a word with me, and then there are even cases like somebody was just vehemently against me for decades. And then a guy in England, but he was a French guy living in England. And just like a few years ago, he sent me an email. He says, I think you were sort of right about that religion. It's like 40 years later, he said, well, I can sort of see where you're coming from. There's this.
Uh, It's interesting. how
Anyway,
they-
I mean, I have a lot of Situationist friends over there, and a lot of them did not break with me. I mean, they understood what I was getting at. And in fact, some of them translated the pamphlet into French. There were 3 different versions,
Huh.
French translations of it. There were people that thought this is saying a good thing. But it's just anyway, I'll send that in my email when I get it.
Just the English one for me.
Yes, yes. Mary.
Well, there we go. Hi. On this comment about people, being very passionate about their hatred for religion and coming out against somebody who isn't as passionate. This is just a commentary I have, like an observation, because I grew up in a family without any religious training. And I'm like, oh, okay, your religion, I'm not, who cares? And I first noticed it with my friends who are now atheists, who were brought up with religion. They're very passionate about it. And they know all these arguments to prove that there's no God. I'm like, well, who cares, And then I noticed it with Gore Vidal and Christopher Hutchins, who are well-known atheists. They're both dead now, but they're still well-known atheists. And they have this passionate dislike of religion. And I've come to the theory, I don't know, that there are like 2 kinds of atheists. There are those of us who are sort of born into it. We don't care. And those of it who sort of convert to it. And they're very passionate about it. And they get angry with somebody like yourself or like me who goes, well, some people get good things out of religion. I, for instance, am a sober drunk. And I know lots of people who are sober drunks who are sober because they believe in God. I do not understand it, but I'm very happy they're sober. And I think it's that aspect of having been brought up in a religion and then rejecting it that makes you very passionate. It's just an idea. That's all.
Yeah.
Their religion is atheism.
Religion is
So,
atheism.
Their religion is atheism.
yeah. Anyway, we're nearing the end
mine.
here.
Maybe.
But since I've yacked away, I do want to give anybody, I'm going to look in the gallery view here for a minute. Any of you, like John Salt, we haven't heard from you. Any words?
Not really. I mean, thank you for asking. I enjoyed reading it and I had little things here and there to say. There was one of the essays talking about man and technology, and it seemed more relevant today than when they wrote it. Just how we have to take control over the machines. And it's like, whoa, that's what everyone's saying now.
Right.
And there were many of those moments,
Yeah.
especially with their foreign policy. It's uncanny how right they were about so many things. And the fact that they dissolved at the peak is all the better. I like it as a narrative.
Uh-huh.
As soon as they approached power, they said, no, we explode power. And so they were righteous. And the more I learn about them, the more I like them.
Yeah. Greg Blipman, any comments or?
Yeah, well, I put in the chat the Rove Venegam also kind of came around on spirituality too, and he wrote that book, The Movement of the Free Spirit, looking at, kind of taking a look at the radical part of
Right.
Christianity in the
Yeah,
1600s.
Yeah, in a sense.
And
Bruce
just
Allen,
oh.
I'm sorry, I didn't see your hand
Oh.
going up there.
That's all right. I just want to make a quick comment on the whole thing about organization. I mean, I've been familiar with the Situationists to some extent for decades now, and I really think that the purpose the situation is situationist groupings inevitably are small groupings, and that they should basically be held together based on essentially two things. One is a worldview that sees that identifies with everything that flows from the idea of all power to the workers' councils, and sees workers' councils as the means by which to transform society, and that their groups should simply be conduits. The groups should be simply conduits to propagate the politics that go with believing in all power to the workers' councils. And the other thing is that they should their purpose should be to propagate that worldview, and that really there's not too much beyond that that's possible other than a process of networking among groups that share those essential perspectives.
Yeah. Thanks. Let's see, Kirsty, are you? Oops. Yeah, Kirsty, any comments or questions? Unmute yourself.
Okay. Yeah, well, I don't have too much to comment. Just kind of, yeah, regarding our last discussion here about the end of the SI, and Zach's comments are really interesting because I feel like, yes, there's certainly issues of Debord and his personality and everything, but yeah, it's like the same, like, what is it that has caused everything to fail in the face of the, current onslaught of capitalism, whatever you want to call it. I think there's, a lot to be thought about in terms of, how was, I mean, I don't know what more could they have done, or, what other groups could come up that are, of course, well, as you always mention, there's Occupy that came up, and that, sort of had its rise and fall as well. But it's just, something for us all to continue thinking about in the current era. And yeah, there's a lot here, like John was mentioning, that seems very, very prescient, or very still true to things that are happening now.
Yeah. Okay, I want to
One quick point, if I could.
oh, sure.
One quick point, if I could. The one word that I left out in what I just said is conduits. That I basically think that situationist groups should simply be, essentially can be nothing more than
Yeah,
conduits.
I think you said that.
Propagating that worldview in that form of political practice.
Yeah.
And that they should limit themselves to that, but proliferate as much as they can within that kind of approach.
Okay, Zach, you had something else to say?
Yeah, I'll just comment, I guess, in
Uh-huh.
response to that. I'm sorry. Yeah, I guess I'm unmuted. Is that, the Situationists themselves had greater ambitions for their organization, for their group, and they talked several times about trying to be a provisional micro society.
Yeah.
That would be a forum for investigating with alternative ways of living, alternative ways to, the existence that's in the conventional society surrounding them. So I think that fact that, discussing their organization, discussing their structure or their attempts at structure, I think really does have some value, because though I think they completely failed to do this, they did have ambitions, and they had concerns about trying to find structures and organizations that could lead to a better way of living and an alternative way of living.
Yeah. Yeah, actually, I and my friends tried to do that. So partly mistakenly. I mean, partly we would read Vanagem and think, gosh, maybe we need to form this little group and share our money, and so even the misunderstandings proved to be fruitful, because it kind of challenged us to do weird things. And
you learn from the mistakes. I mean, it
Yeah,
can be
yeah.
incredibly valuable.
Yeah. So I don't know, some of you who arrived late, I mentioned that I have an eye operation, two of them coming up in late February and early March. It's a routine thing, just, you know, a replacement of the lenses. But it will kind of preoccupy me during that time. I might feel a little bit uncomfortable or stressed or something. So I thought that rather than, I was originally thinking of saying 2 weeks from now, we'll start with Society of the Spectacle. But I thought, let's just wait till after this is over, because otherwise I'd be having that first meeting and then the second meeting would be a month and a half later or something anyway. So I think it will be simpler just to give us all a little break. And I'm planning on March 24th, which is a Sunday, as being our first Society of the Spectacle meeting. And that will go on for about 12 meetings. And as I've said, we'll be doing a very detailed study of this relatively small book. So we'll be far more like every sentence than we're doing here, where we just do occasional passages. And I encourage you, and you should get the book, Society of the Spectacle, my translation, the annotated edition. And so I'll be sending, yeah, I'll be sending out something tomorrow, you know, that will maybe have a few other links and things like that. But basically, just take it easy. If you have the time, I would say get the book and read the book. Probably many of you have already read parts of it or something, but just read it. Yeah, you know, it doesn't hurt to become really familiar with it, including all the notes and all that kind of thing. And then when we start, you'll be all the more prepared. We'll just start with chapter 1, but you'll know kind of what's coming up, and you'll have a little bit more idea so that you're not asking a question that's going to be answered in chapter 2, that kind of thing. So I encourage you to do that, and I want to thank you who have been at this meeting or at the previous ones. I've really enjoyed this, and it's been a challenge for me. I've learned a lot of stuff. Just if I sound like a know-it-all, believe me, I picked up things from you all, your questions, you know, give me new ideas or challenge me to formulate the ones I have already. So, and it's given an occasion for me to to go back and read these things again. So I hope we can continue that in about a month and a half, late March. And until then, have a nice break. Some of you are in my classics literature thing, so I'll see you next week. Any of you others who aren't, you're always welcome to join that too. Just let me know and I'll put you on that list. And but if you're not in that group, I'll see, hope to see some of you on March 24th. So,
Well, thank you very much, Ken.
Thanks, Ken.
Thank you so much.
so I'm leaving. I haven't had a chance to look through the chats, but I'll look through there and see if there's anything. As usual, you can just ask me what the link was or something like that, and I'll try to get back to you. So I'll see some of you in a week and some of you in about a month and a half. And we're gone.